Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we examine continuing attempts to disrupt the FIFA World Cup in Mexico, a major shift in U.S. security cooperation with Venezuela following the killing of a leading organized crime figure, and growing tensions in Peru after a highly contested presidential election. We also assess how the onset of El Niño could increase the risk of disruption and environmental disasters across Latin America. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we look at unrest during the G7 summit in Switzerland, Russia's continuing campaign of large-scale strikes against Ukraine, and a significant diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and Iran. We also assess the implications of El Niño for food security across Africa, political tensions in Nigeria following a court ruling against major opposition parties, and protests in the Democratic Republic of the Congo over proposed constitutional changes. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover new national security measures in Hong Kong and a growing anti-government protest movement in Indonesia. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where protest movements in Mexico continue to use the FIFA World Cup to maximize pressure on the government and increase the visibility of their demands. Teachers associated with the National Coordination of Education Workers Union have continued their nationwide strike action and protests across much of Mexico. On June 13th, CNTE stated that demonstrations and roadblocks would continue after negotiations with the federal government failed to produce concessions. CNTE's key demands include the repeal of pension reforms, salary increases, and changes to teachers' employment conditions. On June 11th, striking teachers gathered near Estadio Azteca and marched towards the stadium in an attempt to block access ahead of Mexico's 2026 FIFA World Cup opening ceremony. Police then established a security zone around the stadium, accessible only to those holding a valid World Cup ticket. However, protesters repeatedly attempted to break through the police cordon. Additional protests have also been staged in central parts of Mexico City, resulting in major disruption. Coordinated protests were also staged elsewhere in the country. In Chiapas, CNTE members occupied a Petróleos Mexicanos facility in Tuxtla Gutiérrez and demonstrated outside Ángel Albino Corzo International Airport. In Guerrero, protesters blocked a roundabout in Acapulco, while in Morelos, clashes were reported between protest groups in Cuernavaca. Smaller disruptive actions were also reported in multiple other locations. Other groups protesting missing persons and violence against women also held demonstrations across Mexico to coincide with the tournament. Now our intelligence team's assessment. CNTE and other protest movements are highly likely to continue leveraging the 2026 FIFA World Cup to maximize visibility and increase pressure on the federal government to make concessions. While Mexico is not scheduled to host any of the tournament's quarterfinals or later stages, protest activity is likely to increase during the final group stage matches and on July 5th, when Mexico City will host one of the round of 16 fixtures. Protest activity is also likely to increase around Mexico's matches, when domestic audience interest is likely to be at its highest. There is a realistic possibility that the federal government's refusal to concede to CNTE will result in an escalation of protest tactics. Potential courses of action include increased roadblocks, toll booth occupations, disruption to airport access, and more frequent attempts to block access to World Cup venues and fan zones. This is likely to increase the risk of violent clashes with the security forces, as well as transport disruption across Mexico. As the tournament progresses and global media attention increases, There is also a realistic possibility that other protest movements in Mexico, the United States, and Canada will seek to capitalize on the World Cup's visibility to amplify their messaging and increase pressure on their respective governments. In Los Angeles, anti-Iranian regime protests involved hundreds of demonstrators outside the stadium, and further protests are likely to be staged around Iran's remaining matches. In Canada, pro-Palestinian demonstrations were held ahead of Canada's opening match against Bosnia and Herzegovina. Several other protest movements across North America have also threatened to disrupt the World Cup in connection with a broad range of issues, including immigration enforcement, Palestinian rights, conflict, housing affordability, the cost of hosting the tournament, human rights, climate change, indigenous rights, labor rights, and gender-based violence. Also in the region, a joint US-Venezuelan operation that killed the leader of Tren de Aragua may signal a broader shift in how Washington approaches organized crime across Latin America. On June 12, US President Donald Trump announced that US and Venezuelan forces had conducted a joint operation that resulted in the death of Hector Rustenford Guerrero Flores, also known as Niño Guerrero, the leader of the Venezuelan cartel, Tren de Aragua. According to U.S. officials, forces from U.S. Southern Command carried out a drone strike in Bolívar State. The strike killed Guerrero and several of his associates. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stated on June 14 that the United States is prepared to conduct additional military operations across Latin America, similar to the recent strike in Venezuela that killed Guerrero. The operations would be carried out under a new regional security framework called the Americas Counter-Cartel Coalition, which aims to coordinate U.S. military and intelligence capabilities with partner governments across Central and South America to target the senior leadership of cartels and gangs. Hegseth also stated that the Venezuelan interim government had invited U.S. military forces into the country to help eliminate the founder of the Venezuelan-born criminal organization. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Tren de Aragua is a Venezuelan-origin transnational criminal organization that emerged in the early 2000s from Tocoron prison in Aragua State, under the leadership of Guerrero. The group remains highly active in Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, and is believed to maintain some operational presence in Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, Panama, Costa Rica, Mexico, and the United States. This makes it one of the most influential organized crime groups in the Americas. Tren de Aragua is alleged to be heavily involved in a wide range of illicit activities, including human trafficking and migrant exploitation, narcotics trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, sexual exploitation, money laundering, illegal mining, and local drug distribution. The strike on Guerrero follows the Trump administration's designation of Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025. The move likely granted the administration greater legal authority to conduct kinetic strikes against the group. It also led to U.S. strikes on alleged narcotics smuggling vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, several of which U.S. officials linked to Tren de Aragua or affiliated trafficking networks. The strike also likely indicates a major shift in U.S.-Venezuela security cooperation following the capture of former Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, which Hegseth argued has fundamentally changed regional geopolitics. Expanded cooperation with the Venezuelan government is likely to improve intelligence collection and coordination, as well as provide greater operational access to networks operating inside Venezuela. This is likely to result in more refined targeting of Tren de Aragua's leadership, trafficking routes, financial networks, and support infrastructure. The killing of Guerrero is unlikely to have a major operational effect in the short term, as Tren de Aragua has evolved into a decentralized transnational network rather than a single hierarchical organization. However, the prospect of increased U.S. coordination with the Venezuelan government is likely to challenge the group's ability to use Venezuela as a safe haven for leadership, logistics, recruitment, and financial activity. Guerrero's death may also lead to greater fragmentation and competition within Tren de Aragua. This could increase the risk of short-term violence between rival factions, a dynamic previously observed in countries such as Mexico following the targeting of cartel senior leadership. Increased regional coordination, emerging security frameworks, and the expansion of FTO designations are likely to serve as early indicators and warnings of similar approaches being pursued elsewhere in the Americas. The Trump administration, under what is sometimes referred to informally as the Don Roe Doctrine, has sought to reassert U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere through a more interventionist security posture. The White House has also increased coordination with several regional governments that share security priorities with the United States, including Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama, and several Caribbean states. U.S. kinetic strikes under the Trump administration have now been recorded against terrestrial targets in Venezuela and Ecuador. Should De La Espriella win the second round of the Colombian presidential election, it is highly likely that Washington will seek to deepen security cooperation with Bogotá. This could potentially lead to U.S. military operations within Colombian territory, a development that would likely pose a major threat to Tren de Aragua, which remains highly active in the Colombia-Venezuela border region. In the long term, there is a realistic possibility that this approach could result in the balloon effect, whereby sustained pressure on organized crime groups in U.S.-aligned jurisdictions drives the migration of criminal activity into less heavily monitored or less capable non-U.S.-aligned states. This phenomenon was observed during the 1980s and 1990s, when U.S.-backed interdiction and eradication efforts in Peru and Bolivia contributed to the displacement of coca cultivation and trafficking into Colombia. Meanwhile, Peru's presidential election remains unresolved, with fraud allegations and political polarization increasing the risk of further protests. Following the second round of the Peruvian presidential election on June 7th, Peru's election administration body, the National Office of Electoral Processes, has yet to declare a winner, despite an estimated 99% of votes now having been counted. As of June 18th, indications suggest that Keiko Fujimori holds a narrow lead over Roberto Sanchez. However, the race remains too close to call officially, with disputed tally sheets still under review by the National Jury of Elections, and Fujimori maintaining a lead of less than 1% over her rival. The final process is estimated to take up to 30 days after the June 7th second round, due to Peru's manual counting system, overseas voting, and dispute resolution procedures. The vote must then be certified by the National Jury of Elections, meaning a formal result may not be confirmed until late June or early July. Throughout the electoral process, there have been several allegations of fraud and irregularities. During the first round, right-wing candidate Rafael López Aliaga alleged that up to 1 million votes had been stolen from his campaign after logistical failures affected polling stations in Peru and overseas. In the second round, fraud allegations have primarily focused on contested tally sheets and alleged irregularities at polling centers. These have included claims of pre-existing marks on ballot papers, interventions by electoral authorities, and the detention of party representatives at some polling stations. Several protests have been organized in response. However, demonstrations have remained limited in scale and have been heavily concentrated around key electoral sites in Lima, including the office of the National Jury of Elections. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Keiko Fujimori is the daughter of Peru's former president, Alberto Fujimori, whose government from 1990 to 2000 remains deeply divisive in Peru due to its authoritarian rule, corruption, and serious human rights abuses. In 2009, Alberto Fujimori was convicted of ordering a 1992 massacre targeting students suspected of belonging to the Shining Path guerrilla group. Keiko Fujimori has campaigned on a conservative pro-market platform, with her right-wing Popular Force Party advocating the adoption of hardline security measures. These include pledges to tackle organized crime, illegal immigration, and extortion. However, because of allegations made against both her and her father, there are widespread concerns that a Fujimori administration would weaken democratic institutions and consolidate executive power. These concerns resonate particularly strongly among rural and left-wing Peruvians. Roberto Sanchez is a left-wing congressman and former foreign trade minister who represents the Together for Peru party, originally formed as a coalition of left-wing and socialist parties. Sanchez is closely associated with the rural and nationalist support base of former President Pedro Castillo. He is also strongly opposed to what is commonly referred to in Peru as Fujimorism, arguing that it has exacerbated inequality, concentrated political and economic power among Lima-based elites, and weakened democratic institutions. The presidential election has therefore pitted two ideologically opposed candidates against one another, each drawing support from markedly different sections of Peruvian society. Fujimori's support is largely concentrated among conservative, urban, business-oriented, and security-focused voters, while Sanchez draws backing from rural, lower-income, and left-wing constituencies. This has created a highly polarized post-election environment. The narrow margin, unresolved tally sheet disputes, and competing allegations of fraud increase the likelihood of further protests during the vote-counting process. They also increase the risk of large-scale nationwide demonstrations once a winner is declared, particularly as Peru is simultaneously grappling with a range of other challenges, including fuel shortages. A Fujimori presidency is also likely to result in a major shift in Peruvian foreign and security policy, realigning Peru more closely with the United States and other right-leaning governments in the region. This would likely involve closer cooperation on counter-narcotics efforts, organized crime, border security, and migration. It would also mark a clear departure from the more nationalist and left-leaning foreign policy positions associated with Sanchez and the Castillo-aligned political bloc. Fujimori's proposed policies have included using the intelligence services to combat organized crime, deploying the conventional military in support of the police, expanding the use of states of emergency, and increasing the use of advanced surveillance technology. Other proposals include reinstating police sweep operations in high-crime areas, expelling foreign nationals who commit crimes, and constructing maximum security mega-prisons modeled on those in El Salvador. If implemented, these and other hardline security measures are likely to significantly alter Peru's security landscape. And across the region, the arrival of El Niño conditions is expected to increase the risk of flooding, drought, infrastructure disruption, and food insecurity. On June 11th, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration formally issued an El Niño advisory, confirming that El Niño conditions had developed in the tropical Pacific and were expected to continue. The advisory followed several months of warnings and forecasts from meteorological agencies around the world, including the World Meteorological Organization and various national climate centers. These organizations had identified sustained warming in the Pacific and increasing signs that El Niño was developing. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has assessed that there is a 63% probability that sea surface temperature anomalies in the Niño 3.4 region of the equatorial Pacific will exceed 2.0 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. This would indicate the potential for a very strong El Niño event, often referred to informally as a super El Niño. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Large parts of Latin America are highly vulnerable to the atmospheric conditions associated with El Niño. Historically, El Niño periods have resulted in severe flooding, landslides, infrastructure damage, and disruption to transport, agriculture, and essential services, particularly in Western South America along the Pacific coast. Peru and Ecuador are among the countries most exposed to El Niño globally due to their proximity to the Eastern Pacific, where El Niño-related warming typically leads to substantial increases in rainfall and, in many cases, catastrophic flooding. A strong El Niño would almost certainly increase the risk of major flooding and landslides, loss of life, agricultural losses and food insecurity, infrastructure damage, and disruption to supply chains, businesses, and transport networks. These developments are also likely to increase the risk of secondary impacts, including civil unrest and public health emergencies. Parts of western Peru and Ecuador are particularly exposed to flooding and landslide risks during El Niño periods. During the 2023 to 2024 El Niño, torrential rainfall linked to warming surface waters and exacerbated by Cyclone Yaku caused widespread flooding, river overflows, and landslides across Peru. By late March 2023, the rainy season had resulted in at least 70 fatalities and affected more than 112,000 people. In response, the Peruvian government declared the highest level of emergency in Tumbes, Piura, and Lambayeque. Ecuador was also heavily affected, leading to a state of emergency across multiple provinces because of flooding. The World Food Programme has also assessed that El Niño contributed to crop losses, food security pressures, and economic hardship across parts of Latin America. This included drought and water shortages in the Central American Dry Corridor, which encompasses parts of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Drought-related impacts were also recorded in Bolivia's highland and Amazon regions, Colombia's Andean and Caribbean regions, and Argentina's main agricultural belt. In Peru, coastal regions are already experiencing pressures associated with warming waters and El Niño conditions. Peru's Commission for the National Study of the El Niño phenomenon has warned that coastal El Niño conditions could continue until February 2027, with moderate intensity expected between May and August. Fishing communities in northern Peru, including Tumbes, near the Ecuadorian border, are already reporting reduced catches and higher operating costs as commercially important fish migrate to cooler waters. Estimates suggest that El Niño-related reductions in fish stocks and agricultural yields can cost Peru up to 5% of total revenue during severe events. However, this El Niño has coincided with fuel shortages linked to the war in the Middle East, rising prices, and other pressures affecting fishing communities. Moreover, there have been several large-scale protest movements involving Peru's fishing sector in recent years, including demonstrations in Lima. Further economic pressure linked to El Niño, fuel costs, and reduced catches is likely to increase the risk of renewed protests, port disruption, and roadblocks in Peru. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where anti-G7 demonstrations in Geneva resulted in clashes with police and reflected wider geopolitical tensions. On June 14th, violent civil unrest occurred in Geneva, Switzerland, on the eve of the 52nd G7 summit, which is being held on Lake Geneva in the French town of Évian-les-Bains. According to police, at least 20,000 people participated in the protests, including approximately 600 Black Bloc militants. Violent clashes between police and protesters were reported near the UN headquarters in central Geneva. Protesters also deliberately vandalized private businesses and vehicles. The protests coincided with several other notable political events. On June 14th, Swiss citizens voted in a referendum on whether to cap the country's population at 10 million people. Switzerland currently has a population of approximately 9.1 million. The proposal was rejected, with the no vote receiving 58.8% support. On the same day, feminist groups staged strikes in several cities. These actions were largely peaceful, although some minor property damage was reported in Zurich. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Protests have occurred frequently during past G7 and G8 summits. Far-left and anarchist activists have almost always played a leading role in organizing these demonstrations, and the unrest has at times resulted in significant violence. In 2001, approximately 200,000 people attended protests against the G8 summit in Genoa. The demonstrations were marked by widespread violence, including incidents of police brutality and the killing of a protester. In 2003, the last time the summit was held in Évian-les-Bains, clashes were reported in Geneva and Lausanne, with multiple injuries recorded. Overall, the 2026 protests have remained relatively more contained than these previous episodes of unrest. The scale of the protests in Geneva was likely in part linked to the referendum, which was marked by a polarized campaign focused primarily on migration-related issues. Moreover, the demonstrations were highly likely driven by wider geopolitical concerns, including the conflict in the Middle East. This was reflected in the deliberate vandalism of assets and private companies associated with the United States, including Tesla vehicles. Finally, the absence of significant civil unrest in Evian, compared with Geneva, was likely due to the decision by French and Swiss authorities to close several border crossings in the area. This measure likely confined many protesters to the Swiss city. Staying in the region, Russia has continued its campaign of large-scale strikes against Ukraine, with Kyiv again the primary target. Overnight, from June 14th to 15th, Russian forces conducted a large-scale layered aerial attack, using 70 missiles and 611 one-way attack drones and decoys. The attack primarily targeted Kyiv, as well as Dnipro and Kharkiv. Ukrainian forces claimed that 20 ballistic missiles and 27 one-way attack drones impacted 42 locations, with debris recorded at a further 12 sites. At least 11 fatalities and 52 injuries were reported nationally, including 5 killed and roughly 35 injured in Kyiv city. During the attack, around 140,000 households lost power in northern Kyiv. In Kharkiv, a reported double-tap strike killed 5 first responders. The head of the Kyiv City Military Administration, Timur Tkachenko, and Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, reported damage across several districts of the city. In Shevchenkivsky, 5 strikes were recorded within 30 minutes, including one on a 25-story residential tower. In Obolon, a residential building partially collapsed. In Solomiansky, a 9-story residential block was impacted, while in Podil, a fire broke out in a 3-story building. In the central district of Pechersk, a 5-story residential block was impacted. Notably, the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra was also affected, with a fire breaking out on the roof of the Dormition Cathedral during the attack. Other cultural sites impacted during the overnight strikes included the Dovzhenko Film Studio in Kyiv, the Dnipro House of Organ and Chamber Music, and the Kharkiv Art Museum. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The major attack was the second Russian strike package in June to use 70 or more missiles. The scale of the attack almost certainly highlights both the increasing production rates of Russian ballistic missiles, with Russia's monthly missile production now estimated to surpass the United States' total production of PAC-3 MSE Patriot interceptors, and the continuation of Russia's previously announced campaign of systematic strikes against Kyiv city. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced its campaign of systematic strikes on May 25th, accompanied by a warning for foreign citizens, including personnel of diplomatic missions and representations of international organizations, to leave the city. The announcement followed the unprecedented attacks of May 24th, during which massed Russian fires were launched into areas of central Kyiv that host foreign diplomatic missions, international organizations, and hotels used by the international community. Those strikes almost certainly marked a shift in the risk profile for travel and accommodation in central Kyiv. The June 14th to 15th strikes resulted in several notable impacts across districts in central Kyiv, including Pechursk, Shevchenkivsky, and Podil. The strikes were likely less distinctly characterized by the escalatory target set seen during the May 24th attacks, which recorded multiple impacts in the government and diplomatic quarters, although this is difficult to assess conclusively given that munitions targeting these areas may have been intercepted. However, the impact on the Pechursk Lavra is symbolically significant, given its status as a center of the Orthodox faith and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The monastery is also immediately adjacent to the government and embassy district. Russian sources claimed that the Lavra was struck by a malfunctioning PAC-3MSE Patriot interceptor. However, this is likely false based on the available evidence, including the reported discovery of Shahed-type one-way attack drone debris at the scene. The director of the Pechursk Lavra described the attack as the first deliberate strike on the complex and the worst damage since the Second World War, although it remains unconfirmed whether the attack was intentional. It also remains unclear whether the attack was a continuation of the systematic strikes campaign against Kyiv, or a direct retaliation for recent Ukrainian attacks, including strikes against targets in St. Petersburg during the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in early June. Before the attack, on June 12th, the Ukrainian Air Force issued a public warning of a high probability that an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile would be launched within 24 hours based on observed activity at the Kapustin Yar range. The Oreshnik has highly likely been used by the Kremlin as its signature instrument of demonstrative retaliation. Examples include its operational use in 2024, following Ukraine being permitted to use ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles against targets in Russian territory, and more recently in May 2026, when its use was claimed to be retaliation for alleged Ukrainian strikes on a student dormitory in Starobilsk. However, the June 14th to 15th strikes did not appear to involve the Oreshnik. This could also be attributed to recent estimates suggesting that Russia may have only one serviceable Oreshnik remaining in its inventory. It is likely that large Russian strike packages, featuring scores of missiles and hundreds of one-way attack drones, will continue to target Kyiv and other major population centers in the coming weeks and months. Previous patterns indicate that Russia can conduct attacks of this scale at a cadence of every 1 to 2 weeks. Russian penetration rates of Ukrainian air defenses are likely to increase, and the effects of these strike packages are likely to worsen. Ukrainian interceptor stocks are unlikely to be replenished, owing to elevated rates of expenditure in the Middle East and extended manufacturing timelines that cannot offset the current rate of consumption. Moreover, despite movement towards an extended ceasefire and renewed negotiations between the United States and Iran, U.S. military planners are likely to continue prioritizing the Middle East theater, given the vulnerability of the current Memorandum of Understanding and the exposure of U.S. military forces. Turning to the Middle East, the United States and Iran have signed a Memorandum of Understanding that has reduced the immediate risk of escalation, while leaving several major issues unresolved. On June 14th, a Memorandum of Understanding between Iran and the United States was announced as agreed by Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. U.S. President Donald Trump stated that the deal includes the toll-free opening of the Strait of Hormuz and ordered the immediate removal of the U.S. blockade. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi also confirmed the agreement on state television. The Memorandum of Understanding had been scheduled for formal signing on June 19th in Switzerland. However, it was signed on June 17th by President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian ahead of the planned ceremony. The signing of the agreement resulted in the de facto suspension of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports, with several Iranian tankers crossing the U.S. blockade line on June 17th. The publicly disclosed terms of the Memorandum of Understanding include an immediate and permanent ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon. The toll-free and unrestricted opening of the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran given 30 days to clear all mines. The immediate removal of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports. A 60-day negotiating window for a final agreement. The immediate lifting of oil export sanctions. A $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran. And the readmission of international nuclear inspectors to the country. Iran will also reportedly reaffirm its commitment to non-proliferation. However, its missile program will be excluded from future negotiations. Despite Iran's demands that the Memorandum of Understanding extend to Lebanon, Israeli operations have continued. On the morning of June 14th, Hezbollah launched several drones towards northern Israel. The Israel Defense Forces subsequently conducted strikes in Beirut's southern suburbs, known as Dahieh. Following the attack, several senior Iranian military and political figures warned that the strike on Beirut will not go unanswered, and that a strong response is coming. U.S. negotiators reportedly scrambled to avoid an Iranian attack on Israel, and no Iranian attack ultimately took place. Gharib Abadi later claimed that Iran's threats helped facilitate progress in the negotiations, resulting in Iranian-requested amendments to the Memorandum of Understanding. Media outlets affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reported that the planned attack was called off due to last-minute concessions offered by the United States. These reportedly included guarantees regarding Lebanon's territorial integrity, an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, and the immediate lifting of the U.S. blockade rather than a phased removal. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The announcement of the Memorandum of Understanding is almost certainly the most significant diplomatic breakthrough since the implementation of the two-week ceasefire on April 8th. With the signing of the agreement, the immediate risk of a return to full-scale conflict between the United States and Iran has likely decreased. However, the Memorandum of Understanding is likely to function primarily as an extension of the ceasefire, rather than as a substantive or durable peace agreement. The agreement is likely vulnerable to multiple points of friction, including the conflict in Lebanon, disagreements over the nuclear file, and issues relating to the Strait of Hormuz. While the United States has allowed Iranian tankers to bypass its naval forces, the U.S. regional force posture remains largely unchanged. Two carrier strike groups remain within the Central Command area of responsibility, alongside multiple surface platforms and dozens of additional combat aircraft forward deployed to regional bases. A reduction in or withdrawal of U.S. forces would likely be a clearer indicator of de-escalation and is likely to be tied to tangible progress on unresolved issues, principally the nuclear file. As long as the current U.S. force posture is maintained, renewed escalation could occur with minimal indicators or warning. If the Memorandum of Understanding collapses, there is a realistic possibility of renewed Iranian strikes against targets in Jordan and the Gulf states. If recent Iranian targeting patterns are sustained, Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain are likely to be more exposed in the event of a ceasefire breakdown. The Memorandum of Understanding reportedly includes an end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, which is likely to be the agreement's first major test. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, has stated that the Israel Defense Forces will remain indefinitely in the security zone in Lebanon. IDF operations in southern Lebanon have also continued, including as recently as June 18th. Moreover, senior Israeli officials and politicians have largely reacted negatively to the announcement of the Memorandum of Understanding. Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, stated that Israel is not bound by the agreement in any way. Israeli opposition to the Memorandum of Understanding almost certainly reflects concerns that the agreement does not meet Israel's key objectives, particularly given that Iran's ballistic missile program has been excluded from negotiations. Israeli opposition or unilateral military action is likely to complicate the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding or undermine the agreement at a later stage. Furthermore, Hezbollah is likely to continue attacks against the Israel Defense Forces and northern Israel in response to ongoing IDF operations in Lebanon. Senior Hezbollah leaders have stated that the group's position will be linked to Israel's adherence to a ceasefire. Additionally, Tehran is likely to continue leveraging the threat of force in response to Israeli operations in Lebanon, both to support Hezbollah and to extract concessions from the United States during the negotiation phase. The primary issue that impeded progress in the Oman-mediated US-Iran talks, which preceded the outbreak of conflict on February 28, was the nuclear file. The Memorandum of Understanding reportedly only involves a reiteration of Iran's previous commitment never to acquire or procure a nuclear weapon, with technical discussions on the nuclear file deferred to a 60-day negotiation window following the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. The most difficult issues to resolve will almost certainly be Iran's buried stockpile of approximately 440.9 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium, enough to produce approximately 10 nuclear weapons if enriched further, and whether Iran will be permitted to retain any domestic enrichment capability. There is no credible civilian requirement for uranium enriched to that level, and Iran's possession of highly enriched uranium has served as Tehran's primary source of leverage. Hardliners within the regime are likely to be reluctant to surrender that advantage. Before the outbreak of the conflict, the Trump administration's position was that Iran should suspend all uranium enrichment and physically surrender its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to the United States. Tehran, however, consistently maintained that the highly enriched uranium must remain in Iran. Washington's position has reportedly softened on both issues. Reports indicate that the United States may now be willing to accept Iran downblending the highly enriched uranium domestically under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, as well as permitting limited low-level domestic enrichment. While the specific details of the Memorandum of Understanding remain undisclosed, senior U.S. officials and political leaders, including Vice President J.D. Vance, have stated that key incentives such as sanctions relief, regional investment funds, and access to frozen assets will be tied to resolving the nuclear file during the 60-day negotiation window. There is a realistic possibility that these incentives, combined with the apparent softening of the U.S. position on nuclear demands, could lead to a nuclear agreement. However, recent CIA assessments have raised serious doubts about Iran's willingness to make the nuclear concessions being sought. The future status of the Strait of Hormuz is also likely to be a major source of friction. While the Memorandum of Understanding reportedly provides for the toll-free reopening of the strait and seeks a gradual return to pre-war shipping volumes, questions surrounding its long-term status remain unresolved and will likely provide Iran with another significant source of leverage. Tehran has continued to signal that transit fees may ultimately be imposed through alternative mechanisms, including service or environmental charges. However, such an arrangement is likely to be unacceptable to the United States and the wider international community, as it would almost certainly be inconsistent with international maritime law and the principle of freedom of navigation. If naval blockades are lifted and commercial traffic increases, mine clearance operations and continued sub-threshold disruptions, including GPS jamming, automatic identification system spoofing, and the harassment of vessels by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are likely to pose ongoing risks to maritime traffic. Across Africa, El Niño conditions are expected to increase food insecurity, displacement, and humanitarian pressures in several regions. On June 11th, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration formally issued an El Niño advisory, confirming that El Niño conditions had developed in the tropical Pacific and were expected to continue. While each El Niño cycle is unique, it typically results in drier conditions across southern Africa and the western Sahel, while above-average rainfall is often recorded in parts of East Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa. African countries have prepared through early warning coordination, anticipatory action planning, food security monitoring, drought and flood contingency planning, and the pre-positioning of support for agriculture, water, health, and displacement risks. In southern Africa and the Sahel, preparedness efforts have centered on drought risk. In East Africa, the emphasis has been on flood readiness. The World Food Programme has activated anticipatory action measures for 2026 in several African countries, including Uganda, South Sudan, Chad, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Niger. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The Sahel has experienced worsening food insecurity for 5 consecutive years, a trend that has been exacerbated by ongoing conflicts between military juntas and violent extremist organizations, as well as broader geopolitical pressures. Dry conditions associated with El Niño increase the risk of delayed planting and poor crop yields across the Western Sahel. The effects can be particularly severe because much of the region depends on rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism. These conditions will almost certainly affect factors such as food prices and migration, while potentially fueling conflict, particularly between herder and farmer communities competing for access to pasture and water. Other armed groups, including the al-Qaeda-affiliated Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin and Islamic State Sahel province, are likely to exploit rising prices and worsening conditions to increase pressure on the military juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In the Horn of Africa, El Niño is more commonly associated with above-average rainfall during the October to December short rain season, particularly across Somalia, eastern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, and Uganda. During the 2023-24 El Niño, heavy rainfall and flooding across Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia displaced more than 4 million people and caused more than 350 deaths. The floods also killed livestock, affected crop yields, and damaged homes, schools, health facilities, and roads. Increased rainfall will almost certainly raise the risk of flash flooding, displacement, transport disruption, humanitarian access challenges, and outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera. In southern Africa, El Niño typically suppresses rainfall during the main agricultural season, which runs from October to March. The 2023-24 El Niño cycle triggered the region's worst drought in more than a century, pushing over 8 million people into food insecurity. Analysis by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations suggests there is a greater than 50% probability of agricultural drought across parts of Namibia, Botswana, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, and Madagascar. This will almost certainly worsen food insecurity, as livestock represents both a source of food and a form of household wealth. As a result, pastoral communities are particularly exposed to pasture degradation, water shortages, livestock losses, and distressed sales. El Niño is developing at a time when many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are already grappling with inflation and rising living costs, driven in part by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. These pressures are compounded by widespread youth unemployment, frustration with entrenched ruling elites, and perceptions of government corruption, all of which are often precursors to large-scale protest movements. Food insecurity caused by drought in the Sahel and southern Africa, or widespread destruction resulting from flooding in East Africa, will almost certainly intensify many of these challenges. Failure by governments to mitigate the worst effects of El Niño is likely to increase the risk of unrest across the continent, particularly where food insecurity, displacement, and disruption to essential services become more severe. Successful mobilization in one country could also create a demonstration effect, encouraging similar movements elsewhere. In Nigeria, a court ruling against 5 opposition parties has raised concerns over political tensions ahead of the 2027 elections. On June 15th, a Nigerian court ordered the country's electoral agency to deregister the main opposition party, the African Democratic Congress, as well as the Accord Party, Action People's Party, Action Alliance, and Zenith Labour Party, over their alleged failure to meet constitutional performance thresholds. Under Nigerian law, a political party must either win at least one elective seat or secure at least 25% of the vote in a state during a presidential election. African Democratic Congress spokesperson Bolaji Abdullahi rejected the ruling, describing it as a direct invitation to anarchy and pledging to challenge the decision through all available legal and constitutional channels. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The African Democratic Congress, a historically dominant party, had become a coalition vehicle for major political figures opposed to President Tinubu ahead of the January 16, 2027 general elections. The party is led by former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, who has repeatedly run for president and most recently represented the People's Democratic Party. The ADC presents itself as a reformist party, emphasizing internal democracy, transparency, accountability, and the inclusion of women, young people, and persons with disabilities. Its 2027 campaign is centered on a living wage, a production-driven economy, and independent electoral management. Historically, the ADC has served as a platform for opposition figures who could not easily unite under Nigeria's more ideologically driven parties, such as the People's Democratic Party, Labour Party, or New Nigeria People's Party. The move almost certainly risks inciting unrest in multiple parts of Nigeria. The ADC's central argument is that Nigeria risks drifting towards a one-party dominant system under the ruling All Progressives Congress. The deregistration of the party is highly likely to trigger legal challenges, and there is a realistic possibility that the ruling will ultimately be reversed. If it is not, opposition leaders are likely to call for protests to increase pressure on the government, arguing that Nigeria is becoming a one-party state. Nigeria is already under significant socio-economic strain. Inflation stood at 15.93% in May 2026, while the combined impact of fuel subsidy removal and rising fuel prices, driven by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, has further increased pressure on the cost of living. High youth unemployment has also contributed to substantial anti-government sentiment, much of which could be mobilized online. If opposition parties call for demonstrations, it is highly likely that they could quickly evolve into a broader anti-government movement, likely led by Nigeria's youth population. Previous protest movements, including the October 2020 #EndSARS movement and the August 2024 #EndBadGovernance movement, were met with crackdowns involving live ammunition, tear gas, water cannon, and mass arrests. Any similar movements are likely to face comparable measures. Such responses could further escalate demonstrations and place significant pressure on the government ahead of the 2027 general elections. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, protests have erupted over proposals that could allow President Felix Tshisekedi to remain in office beyond constitutional term limits. On June 12th, clashes broke out in Kinshasa during a demonstration opposing a referendum on proposed constitutional amendments that would allow Tshisekedi to remain in office beyond the current two-term limit. The protest took place outside Parliament and was organized by the opposition coalition Article 64, a broad political alliance that includes former presidential candidates Martin Fayulu and Moise Katumbi. The clashes reportedly began after security forces attempted to disperse protesters using tear gas and live ammunition. Demonstrators responded by throwing rocks. Several protesters, including Fayulu, were reportedly injured. The government has not commented on whether live rounds were used, while a police official stated that officers had acted to restore order. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The unrest follows the National Assembly's passage of a referendum bill on June 9th, which was subsequently approved by the Senate on June 15th. The legislation establishes the rules for organizing a referendum in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Under the bill, a legal framework has been created for a referendum on a new constitution, which could allow President Felix Tshisekedi to serve a third term by effectively treating it as his first under a new constitutional arrangement. Article 220 of the 2006 Constitution prohibits revisions to presidential term limits, and Tshisekedi's second and final term is currently due to expire in 2028. The vote took place without opposition lawmakers, who boycotted Parliament in protest against the bill. This is highly likely indicative of plans to mobilize widespread unrest should a referendum move forward that enables an extension of Tshisekedi's time in office. Tshisekedi has indicated that he would support a third term if the people want him to have a third term, and his Union for Democracy and Social Progress Party has launched a campaign promoting constitutional reform. The calls for a third term come amid an ongoing crackdown on opposition figures. Human Rights Watch has reported that authorities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo are increasingly harassing and arbitrarily detaining journalists, activists, and political opposition members, often under allegations of links to the AFCM-23 insurgent group. This is the first significant incident of unrest in Kinshasa since January 28 and 29, 2025. During that period, unrest linked to the AFCM-23 capture of Goma escalated into violent demonstrations. Protesters attacked several foreign embassies, burned tires, erected roadblocks, attacked vehicles, and looted property. There were also multiple reports indicating that foreign nationals were deliberately targeted. The last time a president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo attempted to extend his time in office beyond constitutional limits was Joseph Kabila, who sought to delay elections and remain in power after his constitutional mandate had expired. Protests subsequently erupted in Kinshasa, Goma, Lubumbashi, and other parts of the country. The government responded with force, resulting in 40 deaths and 460 arrests. Further small-scale demonstrations against the referendum bill are likely. However, if the bill ultimately enables a referendum on extending presidential term limits, it is highly likely to trigger widespread and potentially violent protests across the DRC. Now, shifting to Asia-Pacific, new amendments to Hong Kong's national security framework have increased concerns over the treatment of travelers, businesses, and foreign nationals. On June 9th, the Hong Kong government introduced updates to the national security law framework that it established in 2020. The new text, known as the Procedural Matters Regulation, aims to establish a mechanism allowing the chief executive to determine whether suspected offences fall within the category of endangering national security and are therefore liable under the NSL framework. Notably, the regulation allows this classification to extend to cases that occurred before the national security law came into force in 2020, raising concerns about a potential violation of the legal principle of non-retroactivity. The national security law, introduced in 2020, established a legal framework to address a range of offences, including secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion. In 2024, the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, commonly known as Article 23, was approved. It introduced a formal definition of national security and granted police additional powers to investigate suspected cases of external interference in Hong Kong's affairs. The latest round of amendments to Hong Kong's national security framework was introduced in March 2026 and focused largely on police powers and penalties for violations. Among the changes, police were granted the authority to requisition mobile phones and other personal electronic devices, compelling individuals to provide passwords or face detention or substantial fines. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The new regulation almost certainly demonstrates the Hong Kong government's willingness to expand the scope of the national security law and to grant the executive significant discretion in investigating and prosecuting behavior it considers threatening, seditious, or contrary to its interests. The legal framework that has developed since 2020 has been characterized by considerable ambiguity. Definitions of national security, state secrets, and other key terms remain largely vague and poorly defined, likely by design, allowing the law to be applied flexibly against perceived threats. Foreign nationals entering Hong Kong, as well as foreign businesses operating in the territory, are almost certainly at a disproportionate risk of being targeted by authorities for alleged national security violations. In December 2025, several foreign media organizations had staff members summoned by the Office for Safeguarding National Security following their reporting on the Wang Fuk court fire, which had killed 168 people the previous month. Authorities stated that the reporting amounted to an attempt to provoke social division and confrontation. Although the incident did not result in any arrests, it likely illustrates how the ambiguity of national security provisions can be leveraged by authorities to exert pressure on foreign actors. The retroactive element of the amendment has been heavily criticized by a range of legal and human rights organizations, and has raised concerns that conduct predating the 2020 national security law could now be treated as a national security matter. The amendment does not make previously lawful acts illegal, and the offences of secession, subversion, and collusion introduced under the 2020 law still cannot be applied to conduct that occurred before its enactment. However, it does allow today's stricter rules and penalties, including the denial of bail, restrictions on early release, and the seizure of assets, to be applied to past actions and even to cases that have already been closed. This is likely to be used to reopen or reclassify politically sensitive cases, and to deter individuals from engaging in activities that authorities may later interpret as threatening to national security. And finally, student-led protests in Indonesia are spreading across multiple cities and could develop into a broader anti-government movement. On June 12th, large-scale student-led anti-government protests were organized in central Jakarta. Demonstrators attempted to march along Jalan Jenderal Sudirman and other major arterial routes towards the Parliament complex. The protests were primarily driven by fuel price increases and the rising cost of living. However, demonstrators also advanced broader demands relating to President Prabowo Subianto's policies. These included calls to repeal several of Prabowo's welfare programs, particularly the Free Nutritious Meals program, which protesters have largely criticized as wasteful and fiscally irresponsible at a time when Indonesia is facing significant economic pressure. By June 15th, the protests had spread beyond Jakarta to other parts of Indonesia, including Semarang and Bandung on Java, Jambi on Sumatra, and South Halmahera in North Maluku. In Jakarta, authorities deployed more than 6,675 police officers as student groups attempted to rally near the State Palace and other government sites. There were multiple reports of protesters throwing stones and bottles at government buildings. Police blocked demonstrators attempting to reach the Hotel Indonesia traffic circle and later clashed with protesters outside the Parliament building after burning tires were placed on the road. On June 17th, more than 1,300 police officers were deployed in Medan, North Sumatra, to respond to protests, while almost 5,000 officers were deployed across parts of central Jakarta. By June 18th, student demonstrations had also been organized in Samarinda City, in East Kalimantan Province, and in Batam on the Riau Islands. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Indonesia has experienced several large-scale anti-government protest movements in recent years, a trend that has intensified under President Prabowo Subianto. This is likely driven by a combination of costly flagship programs, mounting economic pressures, concerns over corruption, and perceptions of increasing military influence in civilian affairs. Prabowo previously served as a general and has long-standing links to the military. While most of these movements have been student-led, many have rapidly expanded to include other segments of Indonesian society, including labor groups, civil society organizations, environmental activists, and academics. The August 2025 protests over lawmakers' housing allowances, which took place during a cost of living crisis, rapidly expanded into a nationwide protest movement. The unrest resulted in at least 8 deaths, more than 1,000 arrests, multiple arson attacks on regional parliamentary buildings, and significant disruption to businesses and transport networks. Student-led protest movements in Indonesia have frequently been organized, coordinated, and amplified through social media platforms, enabling the rapid mobilization of simultaneous demonstrations across multiple cities and provinces. Social media has also often been used to document heavy-handed police responses, which can intensify anti-government sentiment and quickly broaden participation in protests. In August 2025, the killing of a ride-hailing driver by police triggered a major escalation, transforming a demonstration focused on lawmakers' expenses into a broader and more violent anti-government movement. The unrest subsequently spread across the country. Since the August 2025 protests, Indonesia has come under increasing economic pressure. The war in the Middle East has driven higher oil prices, increasing the cost of Indonesia's fuel subsidies and significantly compounding existing economic challenges. The rupiah has also weakened, while foreign investors have sold Indonesian assets, including equities, bonds, and the currency itself, at an unprecedented rate. Investors have cited concerns over policy unpredictability, weakening institutional independence, fiscal discipline, and President Prabowo's increasingly interventionist economic agenda. These economic pressures have almost certainly increased anti-government sentiment across Indonesia, particularly among young people, with youth unemployment estimated at approximately 17%. While the current protests have largely been confined to student groups, there is a realistic possibility that they will attract broader support from other sections of Indonesian society as a result of the country's ongoing economic difficulties. The planned reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is highly unlikely to provide immediate relief from elevated fuel costs or wider inflationary pressures. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.